Repetition, repetition, repetition. These are the opening words of Red or Dead, David Peace's 2013 novel about Bill Shankly, the iconic manager of Liverpool Football Club. They set the tone for a work that relentlessly matches literary form to sporting content. Peace imagines the life of his subject through sheer weight of routine, and then examines what happens when the purpose behind that routine is lost. In the first half of Red or Dead, which covers Shankly's time as Liverpool boss from 1959 to 74, Peace piles detail upon detail, narrating the commitment to hard work and habit that marked Bill Shankly's life. The shorter second half of the novel examines Shankly's life after his resignation in 1974. Shankly quickly regretted leaving Liverpool, but he never came back to football. Though the prose remains clipped, the book at this point shifts gear. David Peace's Shankly becomes an actor without a play, Red or Dead an elegy to what's lost in retirement. My paper today examines one writer's attempt to reconstruct sporting experience via a socialist, a football obsessive, and a good man. It argues that Peace's echo chamber style does something more complex than merely sanitize Bill Shankly as a red saint. By using prose that emphasizes Shankly's and football's routines, Peace, I argue, movingly captures sporting activity at its unglamorous core. B.S. Johnson's boredom with football journalism and the game he's watching in The Unfortunates, the tedious dressing room banter and coach trips in Ross Raisins and Natural. The two other novelists in our original panel today both tell stories of sport that resonate with David Peace's Stakhanovite labours in recounting what drove Bill Shankly. These labours reflect, and reflect on, a remark of Shankly's from his 1976 autobiography. While you love football, it is a hard, relentless task which goes on and on like a river. From a mining family in Ayrshire, Bill Shankly was one of 10 children, including 5 brothers, all of whom played professional football. A Scottish international wing half, he spent most of his career at Preston North End. After injury and World War II curtailed his playing days, Shankly turned to management. He had several short but mostly successful spells at unheralded or declining clubs in the 50s, including Carlisle United, Accrington Stanley and Huddersfield Town. Shankly's big break came in December 1959 when he was appointed manager of Liverpool Football Club. Shankly's impact at Liverpool was revolutionary. When he arrived, the club were in the second division. It had won the English League title once in 36 years and barely warranted the cliched label sleeping giant. By the time he left in 1974, Liverpool was a force at home and abroad. Under Shankly, the club won the league 3 times, the FA Cup twice, and the UEFA Cup. Shankly's successor, Bob Paisley, eclipsed the impressive haul, but the Shankly years were not just about winning trophies. As the city of Liverpool grabbed the world's attention in the 1960s, Shankly was in the eye of a cultural storm. The Anfield crowd became as famous as his team. The swaying mass on the Spion Kop terrace sang show tunes, pop hits, and its own repertoire with a flair and intensity unknown in British football grounds. When Liverpool won the FA Cup for the first time in 1965, and you can see the image in this slide, 250,000 people welcomed the team home. The city centre reception, one police officer remarked, made the Beatles' recent homecoming look like a vicarage tea party. Shankly's final match in charge, an imperious 3-0 victory over Newcastle in the 1974 FA Cup final, ended with 2 Liverpool supporters running onto the field at Wembley Stadium and prostrating themselves at the manager's feet. As another supporter wrote to Shankly at this time, "Some say God, we say Shankly." David Peace remarked after publishing Red or Dead that the Shankly story had been reduced to witticisms. The most famous Shankly aphorism, I'm sure you all know it, some people believe football is a matter of life or death. I can assure you it is much, much more important than that. is almost certainly apocryphal, but it speaks to how Shankly is typically remembered. This is Shankly, the charismatic, rent-a-quote exemplar of the post-war celebrity manager, file alongside Matt Busby, Jock Stein and Brian Clough. This is Shankly as the most revered figure in LFC's history. Only Kenny Dalglish comes close. David Peace's Shankly is different from these personas, more working-class hero than God, to borrow two songs from that rare Scouser who didn't like football, John Lennon. He's also different from the iconic but troubled manager who stars in Peace's 2006 novel, The Damned United, and this is, of course, Brian Clough. Peace's Clough is a booze-soaked enigma caught in a short-lived and disastrous marriage to Leeds United. Peace's Shankly is, as Peace himself admits, a good man, as close to a saint as you could really get. There's no scandal or drink to work with in the story of Shankly's life. He can't really escape his own halo. So then, how to depict, as Dostoevsky said of Prince Mishkin, the kind-hearted hero of his 1868 novel, The Idiot, the positively good man? There's nothing more difficult in the world than this, Dostoevsky wrote to his niece. Peace's answer takes us back to the novel's opening line. Repetition, repetition, repetition. Here's a typical paragraph from the novel's 90 chapters and 714 pages. On Saturday, the 19th of October 1966, Leeds United came to Anfield, Liverpool. That afternoon, 51,014 folk came too. In the 43rd minute, Chris Lawler scored. In the 57th minute, Peter Thompson scored. In the 75th minute, Jeff Strong scored. In the 83rd minute, Ian St John scored. And in the 89th minute, Strong scored again. And Liverpool Football Club beat Leeds United 5-0 at home at Anfield. This boldly descriptive approach is not confined to matches. Here's Peace's description of Bill Shankly doing one of his domestic chores, laying out the breakfast table. Bill walked back to the table. Bill put the salt and pepper pots on the table. Bill went to the pantry. Bill opened the pantry door. Bill took out a jar of honey and a jar of marmalade. Bill walked back to the table. Bill put the jar of honey and the jar of marmalade on the table. I think by now you're beginning to get the picture. Everything in David Peace's literary approach is geared to the repetition of largely mundane tasks. After the training, before the training. After the season, before the season. This is all about footballs and life's circularity and even tedium, something I think we can all relate to in this past very long year. Both football and life simply go on. Critics responded to David Peace's novel, as you might imagine, in different ways. The harshest review came from Simon Cooper in the Financial Times. Red or Dead, he wrote, reads like a statistical football annual written by someone studying from an MA in creative writing. If it had been Peace's first novel, Cooper argued, it would never have been published. Writing in the New Statesman, Jonathan Wilson was more sympathetic. He recognised that even as the eyes glazed over the hundreds of match reports in Red or Dead, those reports spoke to something important, the unacknowledged fact of football and sport generally. It's one game after another without respite. Frank Cottrell Boyce in The Observer called Red or Dead a masterpiece, albeit a caveat. This was a masterpiece that is openly hagiographical and in which the temptation to skip pages is enormous. Mark Lawson, finally, in The Guardian, was effusive. In his view, Peace's hypnotic repetition, brilliantly and exactly, and I quote, suggests a mind and a life moving through and sometimes stuck in a shallow groove, seeing no other routes, end quote. What if, for great athletes, asked David Foster Wallace in his 1992 essay, How Tracy Austin Broke My Heart, cliches were not trite, but true? What if they were simple imperatives that are either useful or not useful, Foster Wallace wrote, and if useful, to be invoked and obeyed, and that's all there is to it. The tunnel vision of great athletes, and indeed great coaches, doesn't necessarily require deep thought or flights of literary fancy. To reimagine Shankly in the pages of a novel, then, is to dwell in the shallows, in the one-dimensional focus on the next training session, the next game, the next season. So what interests me is what divided critics about Red or Dead. How do we tell the story of sport through the essentially unvarying nature of sporting experience? David Peace's novel is not without its highs and lows. In chapter 18, for example, titled "The World Turned Upside Down," Peace recounts the greatest triumph of the Shankly era, Liverpool's first FA Cup in 1965, alongside the suicide of overworked club secretary Jimmy McInnes, who hanged himself from the rafters of the Kop 4 days after the win over Leeds United. But these highs and lows are frequently subsumed beneath the workaday realities of Shankly's job and life. There's a sense here that success brings only temporary relief, that, as the great Ukrainian coach Valery Lobanovsky said, a realized dream ceases to be a dream. With this in mind, I'll look briefly today at 2 everyday scenes from the novel, one from the first half, covering Shankly's tenure as Liverpool manager, and one from the second half, which runs from Shankly's retirement in 1974 to his death in 1981. In these scenes, I want to focus on the role of hard work and routine in both Shankly's life and Peace's prose. In the first half of the novel, these good habits are embedded. In the second half, hard work and routine are rendered less purposeful, leaving Shankly lost and the reader increasingly aware that he's lost. Chapter 7 in part 1 has a typical Peacean title, half football cliche and half philosophical musing on the treadmill of professional sport. To begin again at the beginning again. It covers 1961 to 62, Shankly's second full season in charge, when Liverpool won promotion to the First Division. Peace takes us to pre-season training at Melwood in July 1961. In his usual methodical fashion, he walks us through day 1. Shankly greets the players in the car park at Anfield. He asks about summer holidays and families. The players take the coach to Melwood. The players jog around the training pitch and then do light passing exercises in pairs. This routine is followed and repeated in Peace's prose with minor amendments until the second week of pre-season. At this point, Shankly and his coaches introduce players to the box. In Shankly's later description, the box was a training device that, he said, used boards like the walls of a house, with players playing the ball off a wall onto the next. The ball was played against the boards, you controlled it, turned round and took it again. Peace's prose drops us into the box with the players and the balls and seeks to capture the exhausting nature of football training. And by all accounts, the box was something of a torture chamber for Liverpool players. And then the players went into the box in pairs and a ball came over the top into the box. And the first player shot against one board, first time. Then the other player hit the same ball on the rebound, first time, ball after ball. Every second another ball, ball after ball into the box. Every second for 1 minute, ball after ball into the box. Then for 2 minutes, ball after ball into the box. Then for 3 minutes, ball after ball into the box. Again and again, ball after ball into the box. Every second, shot after shot, every second, inside the box. Player after player, pair after player, the players working in the box working on the players. It's quite exhausting just to say it, let alone to experience it. So repetition and work, these are the cornerstones of Shankly's approach to training, as we see in the box, and to Peace's approach to writing about Shankly. In the litany of unvarnished language here, it's quite easy to miss the fact that Peace is flagging up training ground innovation, the basis for Liverpool's rise in the 1960s. Hard work's not done simply here for hard work's sake, but to embed a pass and move style later known as the Liverpool way. Training routines concentrated on ball work in the box and in five-a-sides. The players of Liverpool Football Club, Peace wrote, did not practice set pieces. They did not practice corners, and they did not practice free kicks. The players of Liverpool Football Club practiced passing. Always forward, always faster. Faster and faster, always forward. Always forward, and always to a red shirt. Always to a red shirt, a red shirt. The second half of Red or Dead takes Shankly and the reader away from the ferocious but comforting grind of training that we see in Chapter 7. Chapters 51 and 52 take place shortly after Shankly's retirement on the 12th of July 1974. At the end of Chapter 51, Peace recreates an awkward conversation between Shankly and Liverpool chairman John Smith. Smith has just appointed Shankly's assistant, Bob Paisley, as its successor. He gently informs Shankly that his presence at Anfield and at Melwood is no longer welcome. Up to this point, Shankly, despite his ostensible retirement, has continued to come to work. The players had continued to call him, not Paisley, boss. So this is a turning point in the novel and a moment of belated realisation for Shankly that, with regards to Liverpool, it really was all over. Chapter 52, given the prosaic title On Watering the Garden, follows Shankly after his meeting with John Smith. He goes to his office at Anfield, collects his kit bag and drives home to West Derby. His wife Ness notes that he's home early. Shankly politely declines a cup of tea and then begins to fill the void left by his banishment from LFC. In 7.5 relentlessly dull pages, Peace's Shankly first washes the car. Then, after again turning down a cup of tea, he starts to garden. And there's a heartbreaking moment of mimesis here. Shankly begins by walking up and down the small back garden, picking up, quote, every little stone he saw, every little piece of grit and every pebble. You can see the extended quote here on the slide. In describing these actions in 1974, keen readers of the novel will note that Peace echoes an earlier clean-up at Melwood. Melwood in 1959 was Liverpool's very dilapidated training ground, and this earlier description comes from a time just after Shankly has been appointed as manager in 1959. Then Shankly and his staff had walked across the training pitch at Melwood, quote, picking up every stone they saw, every bit of brick and every piece of broken glass. Again, pulling up every weed they found, every dandelion and thistle. Again, putting the stones into their sacks, putting the weeds into their sacks. Again. The purpose of the cleanup in 1959 is clear. It's to pave the way for the kind of training environment that we see in 1961 and 62 in Chapter 7, for the kind of training environment that will build Liverpool into the bastion of invincibility, as Shankly described it, that the club became by the end of his time as manager. Shankly's gardening in the summer of 1974, putting weeds and dandelions once again into his black bin bag, mowing the lawn, pruning, shearing, weeding, doesn't really lead anywhere. When it was done, Peace writes, there was nothing more to do. That was it, that was all. No more work to be done here. In his review of Red or Dead, Frank Cottrell Boyce praised the Shakespearean grandeur that Peace gives to Shankly's rejection by Liverpool Football Club. There's no great tragedy in the book's second half. Shankly retired to spend time with his family, to be a better, more present husband, father and grandfather. He was not, from all that we know, tortured or seriously unhappy in his final years. In fact, Peace's retired Shankly smiles a great deal. What we see in the novel's final 300 pages is a quieter, more bittersweet kind of pathos. Liverpool Football Club is the itch that Shankly can never quite scratch. He talks to the press and supporters. He gives advice to ex-players turned coaches. He still goes to games, often at the home of Liverpool's local rivals, Everton. But he comes home from those games, in Peace's words, always thinking of another game, of a different match, the game he had not been to, the match he had not seen. Shankly gets a ticket from Liverpool for the club's 1978 European Cup final at Wembley Stadium. But he leaves the game early, shortly after Kenny Dalglish's decisive goal against the Belgian side, Club Bruges. On the empty train from London back to Liverpool, Peace writes, Bill Shankly thought about the things he was missing, the victory and the celebrations, the party and the speeches, all the things he was missing, his home and his wife. His home he was missing, his wife he was missing, and Bill Shankly smiled. In an interview in 2013, David Peace spoke of why he'd written Red or Dead in the way that he did. It was not, he said, to be obscure or avant-garde or off-putting. Instead, he'd wanted to show the sacrifice and struggle that went into Bill Shankly's making of Liverpool FC. And I'll quote Peace here. I do think that if you write a sentence like Bill Shankly trained every day for 15 years with his team, that sentence doesn't do justice as to exactly what that entails. In the repetition, I was really trying to convey, as Shankly himself said, this kind of relentless river that went on and on. There was no stepping out of it. It drained and exhausted him in the end, but it was also sustaining him at the same time. Football for Bill Shankly was not a metaphor for life, it was life. Without a football club to run, without the purpose provided by football, that basic discipline, those basic routines, Shankly in retirement was inevitably, like so many of us, a diminished figure. But he was not a tragic one. As befits David Peace's good man, Bill Shankly left the stage with more grace and dignity than anger and bitterness. Thanks very much for listening.